Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 1, beginning at verse 6. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as the people of Israel went into exile and had to learn how to live in a foreign land with secular things all around them, help us, Lord, to recognize that we're in a similar situation. The world is against you, and there's paganism all around us. Help us to stand firm in faith as Daniel and his friends did, so that we might be a witness to the truth of Jesus Christ and what he has done to save us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so last week when we were doing the introduction to Daniel, we were talking about the background of the book, right? And so it was probably written. Oh, where's the sheet that I handed out last week? Okay, so on the sheet it talks about how most likely Daniel wrote the book around 530 BC, which would have been after the events of the Babylonian Empire and after the Persian Empire took over. So you can see on the sheet I mentioned how King Cyrus of Persia, who was the one who destroyed or took over the Babylonians in 539, that Daniel wrote it about 9 years after that event happened. And so we see that some of the beginning parts of his serving under the Persian Empire are at the end of this book, right? And the book is divided up into three main sections. There's the prologue, which we're in right now, chapter 1. There's the visions of the nations, which is written in Aramaic, a different language, chapters 2 through 7. And then the final visions of the coming of the Son of Man, which are chapters 8 through 12, written in Hebrew. So you notice that the first chapter is Hebrew, and then the last 5 chapters are in Hebrew, and then that middle section is in Aramaic, right? And so Aramaic was the language of the Persian Empire. It was part of the official imperial writings of the time. It was used from the 400s all the way through the time of Jesus, right? So even Jesus spoke Aramaic. Right? And Aramaic is a language that uses the Hebrew letters of the alphabet, but it's just a different language. Kind of like, if you didn't know anything about languages and you came from outer space and then you saw Spanish and English, the letters look the same. Maybe it might be a couple of little squiggles that are different. Yes. But other than that, you might say, well, this is the same language compared to Japanese and Chinese, right? Those are completely different. So, but Aramaic uses the Hebrew alphabet, but it's a different language, so the words are different. Some of the words are the same, like in English we have words that are similar to other languages, right? But it doesn't mean that those words are the same language, right? So Aramaic was the middle section probably was written based on some of the decrees of Cyrus, as well as when the Persians took over, because he wrote it after the Persians had taken over, and so writing it in their imperial language was a way of legitimizing it as a witness to the people at the time, to the people who were in control, but also to show that God is still going to use people where they're at, right? So we don't need to be for the exiles. They longed to be back in Jerusalem, back in Israel. That wasn't going to happen. A lot of them were going to be, even after the exile was over and Cyrus freed people, Daniel never went back. A lot of people stayed in the foreign countries that they were taken captive into. And so we're going to see the prologue. Chapter 1 is talking about the conflict that begins after they were taken into exile. So the main exile was 586. That's when Jerusalem fell. But the exile of the Middle East actually started in 605. And that's when Nebuchadnezzar started a campaign, and he went from Babylon, which is in Iraq, and he went along the Fertile Crescent, along the Fertile Crescent above the Arabic desert, right? So you can't cross through the desert, so you cross over the desert where the Fertile Crescent is. You go to the coast and you follow the coast down to Egypt. So that's what he did in 605, is he conquered everything all the way down to Egypt, except for Judah. You might say, well, why did he miss Judah? Well, it's not that Nebuchadnezzar missed Judah. It's that he took some people prisoner in the northern parts of Israel, and even in probably around Jerusalem, he might have taken some people captive as the first exiles. But he didn't destroy anything because King Jehoiakim, which I mentioned last week, who was in control at this time of Judah, that he had already submitted to Nebuchadnezzar. So, and that's found in 2 Kings 24, verse 1. Just look that up real quick. 2 Kings 24, that is, verse 1.
Days Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him.
Okay, so notice that Jehoiakim, so he submitted, and for 3 years, in just a sentence, it sounds like, oh, yeah, he submitted, and then he turned and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Well, in those 3 years, the reason why he wasn't destroyed on that first campaign in 605, and actually Nebuchadnezzar went all the way down to Egypt, and he took over the country of Egypt. He actually destroyed the Pharaoh and took over all of the most powerful country in the area at the time. But Judah was spared because in submitting, Jehoiakim was basically saying, I'm just your vassal. You are the emperor, and I'm going to submit to you, and I'm also going to pay you tribute money, right? So it was kind of international extortion, right? So it was like hush money. You pay it off or you get killed, right? And so that's what he did. And that's why it only lasted 3 years, because the amount of taxes that Jehoiakim had to raise in order to pay the tribute money to Babylon was so great that the people eventually said, well, we can't afford this. This is destroying us. We're not going to pay it anymore. And so they would either start a civil war against Jehoiakim, or Jehoiakim just joins the people and says, okay, we're going to stop paying it, and then wait and see what happens. And then what happened was, 586, the Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city of Jerusalem. I mean, it didn't happen right away, because in those 3 years that he was paying, he postponed the destruction of Jerusalem. And then after, then I think King Nebuchadnezzar came down and took him off the throne and put Jehoiachin on the throne. That's just his son. And then he tried to pay it for a little while. Then I think it was a year later that he stopped the payments as well. And then he was taken off the throne, and Zedekiah was put on the throne. So Nebuchadnezzar had 3 different kings from Israel that he put on the throne in Judah until he got fed up. And when the third guy tried to stop paying the money, that's when Jerusalem was destroyed in 586. So, it was still a little process. But in the meantime, Daniel had been taken as a young man, as a prisoner to Babylon early on. So 605 is when that happened. And so he was probably under the age of 20. And, he was subjected to the king's whims. I mean, the king didn't just take anybody into exile, right? There was 3 groups of people that King Nebuchadnezzar took into exile. He took the royal families, he took the nobility, the aristocracy, the people who had money, and he took the priests, right? So people who were influential. If you were poor, they didn't care about you. They just left you behind. And those are the people who ended up getting intermarried with people who were moved from other countries, right? So people from Syria, people from Mesopotamia were moved into Jerusalem area, and then the poor people who lived there, maybe they ended up, having their kids marry off, and that's where the Samaritans came from, because you had people who were Jewish, but then they ended up marrying non-Jewish people, and then so they diluted it wasn't just diluting their ethnicity, but they were diluting their religion, right? I mean, the whole reason that the exile happened was because the people of Israel were worshiping idols, so God punished them by sending them to exile. When they got into exile, we see that they realized we were destroyed as a nation because we disobeyed. Now, in exile, we refuse to disobey, even if we die. So that's what we're seeing in this first chapter. Daniel and his friends are going to say, we'd rather die than break the laws of the Old Testament. And that includes all of this, of the Sabbath laws and the ceremonial laws, right? So any questions so far before we start reading verse 6?
My question is, how do you remember all those long names?
Practice.
Yeah, practice. Lots of years of reading it.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know.
and teaching it also. I teach
Was
it.
I mean, most of them are compounds, right? And they
Right.
And they have meanings. Would they be words that were in common use at the time, so that the people, to them, it would sound like American Indian names sound to us, like Sitting Bull and Running Horse and whatever.
Yeah.
So that they would remember the meaning of it.
The way it works is that when we get into verse 6, we're going to see that so they had Jewish names, and then the king gave them new Babylonian names. And the Babylonian names referred to the gods that they were basically trying to submit them under. They were trying to force them to become Babylonians. And it's true that that the names meant something, but they also would have been understood by people in the culture as referring to specific gods. The only problem is that they were so commonly used that sometimes when you hear the word Sophia, what do you think?
Sophia Loren.
Yeah, it's a woman's name, right? It's just a woman's name. But anybody who studies Greek mythology knows that Sophia is the goddess of wisdom. So she's a goddess, but it's also a name. So now you got these people who.
It's also the Greek word for wisdom.
Yeah, what's the goddess of wisdom? That's where the word wisdom comes from. And the same thing with the names that we're going to see here is that they're actually names of the gods of the Babylonians.
Yeah, I was just in response to Shira's question. The names to them did not sound like just a lot of syllables.
Right.
It
Oh, it
sounded
had
like
meaning.
words that they already knew well that were just put together in names.
Exactly. So yeah, they have meaning, and so for foreigners, you don't always know the meaning. That's why it's good to have a study Bible that'll usually tell you information about that. But for our purposes, is what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the names are. We're going to talk about what they meant, and then consider what was going on by the king of Babylon trying to force new names. I mean, why give them new names? Why don't just call them Daniel? And I see the funny thing is that, and I don't even know their names from memory in Hebrew. It was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I know their Babylonian names better because when I was a kid, I was in a VBS play or something like that where we sang a song about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
That was on the radio.
Yeah.
Big hit.
Yeah.
Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego.
Lived in Judah a long time ago. Okay. Yes. So let's look at verse 6, and then we'll read through the names and we'll talk about that. Could somebody read that?
Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah.
Okay, so so it tells us that the verse before that talked about how they were trained in Babylon for 3 years, right? So they took the best and the brightest and brought them into this school. It would have been like a magi school, right? We can call it a wise men's school, but the whole point is that these are people who studied astrology. They studied the pantheon of the gods of Babylon. They studied the language of Babylon, and as well as mathematics and any biology, anything that was known at the time was part of their studies. And it was important because the king was looking for advisors, and he wanted the smartest people. And so he recognized that, smart people aren't just people who are part of your country. He didn't commit the fallacy that Hitler committed during World War II, where he thought because the Jewish people were inferior, that's what he believed, there's no way that they could have know anything that could hurt us in the war. But Einstein and a lot of the other Jewish scientists who have fled Germany are the ones who helped develop the atom bomb that helped destroy end the war and stop Hitler and the other allies, or the Axis, right? And so we see that Nebuchadnezzar didn't think like that. He thought, okay, I conquered these people, I'm going to skim the cream of the crop off, and I'm going to take it for myself. So the names that we have, Daniel, of course, is the one that is the writer of the book, but his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, each one of these words in Hebrew has a meaning. Whenever you see the word El at the end of a name, that's the Hebrew word for the word God. El means God. So Dan-E-L means, and also the letter I is usually a suffix at the end of a word that means my. So that means my judge. So Dan means judge. E, the letter I that is the word my, and then El means God. So Daniel is Hebrew for my judge is God. And then the next name, Hananiah, is Hebrew for gracious is, and then you see, when you ever see the I-A-H ending on a word, that's actually the Hebrew letters J-A-H. So it's Yah. It's pronounced Yah. So in English we say Hananiah. Sometimes we say it fast so it sounds like ah, but it's actually Yah. And that Yah is short for Yahweh. That's God's name, right? So El means God, but Yahweh is the name of God. So here that means gracious is Yahweh, or gracious is Yah. And so, you can see that their names represent that they looked to the God of the universe, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who is the creator of all things, and he's the only true God. So Daniel is found, the word Daniel is found in several places in the Old Testament, maybe under a dozen times, mostly in this book, but a couple other places like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. But Hananiah is found 26 times in the whole Old Testament. And then the next word, Mishael, is found 8 times in the Old Testament. Mishael is Hebrew for who is what God is. Who is what God is. So it's kind of a question, right? It's like saying who's greater than God?
It's a rhetorical question.
Rhetorical question, right? Yeah, obviously the answer is no one.
No one.
Yeah, right. No one is greater than God. And then the final one, Azariah. So you can see the word I-A-H at the end means, that's short for Yahweh. So it means Yahweh has helped, or God has helped. And then it's implying helped me, right? So the person who has that name, their parents either thought God had helped them by giving this child, and they named the child God has helped, or maybe they wanted that child to have the encouragement of knowing that God would always be in their life to help them, right? So it's just a way of encouraging. All of our names mean something. A lot of times, especially in our culture today, people have no clue what their name, why the parents don't know what their name means. Sometimes they just like the sound of it. Like my wife's name, Kadma, her mom heard a singer in Brazil with that name once when she was young and said, I like that name. And then she decided to name her child that, not knowing that, first of all, it's a Hebrew name, and it means impact. And, by God's grace, it's appropriate. It's appropriate. Yeah. So it's interesting how sometimes we live up to our names. A lot of historical critical scholars believe that that names that have to do with the character of a person were actually made up, because they believe there's no way you could name a child knowing what they're going to be like, right? I mean, when they're born, you don't know how they're going to be like. But then if they end up acting in a way that their name represents, then obviously this is just a myth, and then somebody made up the name to explain the reason why the person is the way they are. But we know that from the Bible that is not the way it works. That God sees who we will be. For instance, who gave Isaac his name? God did, right? When God shows up at Abraham's tent, and then he says, now that you're 99 years old, you're finally going to have a child. You're going to have a son born to you in a year. And then he laughed. And Isaac is Hebrew for laughter. So he says, why did you laugh? And he says, I didn't laugh. And he says, yes, you did. And now the child you are going to have next year, you shall call him laughter. So God is the one who foresees our future. He's the one who knows our lives, and he's the one who can guide us. For instance, the name Jacob means heel grasper. Now, when Jacob was born, his brother Esau put his hand out first of the womb, so they put a red string around his hand so that when they could recognize that he was the firstborn, right? So he would be getting the blessing, he would become the next patriarch, and all that stuff. But then Jacob pulled his way out, and he was born first, even though he didn't break the womb first, and they called him heel grasper. Now, the word heel grasper in Hebrew eventually took on the term of a person who is like a trickster, right? And so, and obviously through his life, Jacob tries to trick people. He tricked his brother out of he didn't technically trick him out of his birthright. He offered him the soup or the stew, and his brother gave it up. But then he tricked his father out of blessing his brother, and he got the blessing. So, some people, some scholars have tried to claim, well, what happened was that these stories of these people were made up and that they just gave names to explain the story. Why would he be called trickster unless it was a story about a trickster? So they just made up a story. So, but this is from a perspective that the Bible is not, it's not a divinely inspired book. And and the reason I tell you this is because the majority of mainline denominations teach that interpretation of the Bible. They do. And so pastors from mainline denominations who believe that the Bible is a human book, that it was has mistakes in it, and that there are logical explanations for the things in it. For instance, miracles are just superstitious remembrances of a ancient people. Right? And so that's kind of an arrogant way of thinking, like everybody who was born before us, it was stupid, and we're the smartest people who ever lived. That's just ridiculous. And yet that is what scholarship is like today. That's what it's been like for the last couple hundred years. Historical critical methodology came about in the 1800s in Germany when the scholars tried to make biblical interpretation more scientific. So they didn't, and it was a way of like saying, well, don't just brush us aside. You got physics and you got mathematics. Theology can be just as scientific. So they started instituting all kinds of ways that were man-made, logical ways of interpreting the Bible that tried to bring theology into the new era after the Enlightenment. And what we're doing is we're living in the consequences of that type of interpretation, because now the majority of the majority of Christians in the Western world actually have a worldview that's based on more science than the Bible. And you can see that just by the way people act and the way people do things. But if we recognize that, if we're going to admit and say that we believe that the Bible is God's word and it's inspired, that changes the way we approach it. So we can look at these names and say God knew who these people were, so their names represented something that God was promising in their life. It was a blessing. Their parents were blessing them by giving them a name, like gracious is Yahweh. Who is what God is? Yahweh has helped, right? Then we get to the next verse and we see that this new king who's in control of these young men who are in this Wiseman school, he wants to impose his culture upon them and change them. Right? And how do you change somebody? Well, you change their name. God did that when he changed Abram's name from Abram, which is Hebrew for father, to Abraham, which means great father. Right? And so in a way, that would have been an insult. Why would God call Abraham a great father when he had no children? And he didn't have any children of his own with his wife Sarah for another 26 years. So, those 26 years he might have been thinking, was God just making fun of me? Unless he had faith, and then he believed that God was going to fulfill his promise. And that's what the Bible says in Hebrews 11. Abraham believed that God would be faithful to his promise. So, it wasn't an insult when his name changed. So he was growing into what it meant to be a great father, because eventually he would be a great father. Okay, so let's look at the names that Nebuchadnezzar gives to the new people under his control. Verse 7.
The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name of Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego.
Okay, so these names here, you can see that some of them sound similar, like Azariah to Abednego, Mishael to Meshach. So in a way, they almost sound like he was trying to come up with a name in his own culture, or it doesn't say it was Nebuchadnezzar, but it was his servant, the chief official that we talked about earlier, Ashpenaz, right? So this guy is giving them the new names based on something in the Babylonian culture that sounded similar to their Hebrew names. You know, when a lot of people came from Europe through Ellis Island and to America, they were actually given new names as well, right? And part of it had to do with sometimes simplifying a name. Like my great-grandfather's last name had a T in it, Wenz, with a T. When they got to Ellis Island, they said, we got too many Wenzes, drop the T, now you're Wenz. But some people's names were completely changed. I've heard people whose names were, something unpronounceable, and then the guy at Ellis Island said, I don't like that, you're Smith. And so it had to do with coming to a new country, being given a new name.
Yeah, they did that with Jerry's grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
and it continued. Yeah, Mitsuyoshi was Paul.
Yeah, so that's true for all kinds of cultures. So in this culture, the names actually meant something. So let's see. The first name,
Bell is what it said.
yeah, Belshazzar, right? So you might be familiar that later in the book of Daniel, there's another person with a similar name, right? It's the great grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. His name is Belshazzar. Here it says Belteshazzar, right? It has a T in it, or a TE in it, I guess. So it adds an extra consonant or something like that. So some scholars believe that that the author of Daniel, whether it was real Daniel or not, was trying to differentiate the king later on, Belshazzar, from Belteshazzar, and so changed the name of Daniel slightly here, because if it was the same name, it would be confusing, or maybe there are some other reasons. These are just theories, right? So that doesn't mean that that's true. But if you tried to figure out what does Belteshazzar mean in Babylonian, it means Bel, protect his life, right? So it's like a prayer. It implies the word may Bel protect his life. Does anybody know who Bel is?
One of the gods of Babylon.
Right. Bel is another name for the head deity of the Babylonian pantheon, and his name was Marduk, right? And so Marduk, there's a Babylonian creation myth called the Enuma Elish, where Marduk, I think I mentioned this last week, Marduk is the king of the gods, kind of like Zeus, right? So you got the king of the gods, and then there's this other god named Tiamat, who tries to take over, right? And so the two gods are fighting it out, and so Marduk kills Tiamat, and Tiamat is a dragon, a woman in the shape of a dragon. And after Marduk kills Tiamat, he cuts her body in half. He uses half of her carcass for the sky, and the other half of her carcass becomes the land. And then her blood and bones become humans. So that's the so-called creation myth of the Babylonians. So that's where these names come from. So Bel was just another name for Marduk, right? And so in that language. And so it's similar to, you guys know what, the Greek name Zeus is also the name in the Roman pantheon for, who's the king of the gods in the Roman pantheon? It's the same god, it's just a different name.
Is it Jupiter?
Jupiter, right. So Zeus and Jupiter are the same words. They're the same names. They're just different cultures calling the name. So there was the Babylonian Empire at this time is sometimes called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, because there was a Babylonian Empire that existed hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years before the time of Nebuchadnezzar. He just took on the name. It's kind of like, in the 500s, or no, actually even in the year 1000 AD, Charlemagne was the king of Europe, and he was crowned on Christmas Day as the king of the Holy Roman Empire. Was there a Roman Empire in 1000 AD? No. The Roman Empire fell in 500 AD, and there was just vestiges of the Roman Empire, and it was almost like the European countries wanted to bask in the glory of the ancient world, so they continued to have this idea that they still were part of the Roman Empire. So
That was the joke among historians. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy.
wasn't holy, wasn't
It
Roman,
an
wasn't empire. There, yeah, that's right. And so, but in Babylon and the Babylonian case, Nebuchadnezzar was probably one of the strongest emperors that ever lived, and he absolutely did have an empire. And but the thing is that there had been empires in the same area before him, and so he kind of took over the same names and the same gods, and he worshipped the same pantheon. But then they had other names. So they had given the name Bel for Marduk. So when he calls Daniel Belteshazzar, that means Bel protect his life. It would be almost like if someone changed your name to Zeus protect me, right? And if you're a Christian, you absolutely don't want that name. Yeah, and so this would be an insult. So we know that throughout the book of Daniel, whenever these people are talked about, their Hebrew names are used, unless they're in the presence of Babylonian officials who call them by their other name, by their new name. So they refused to accept these names, but because they didn't want their heads cut off, they used them when they were doing official business. So we see that there's nothing particularly wrong or evil about having a name that has another god associated with it. I mean, because a lot of times we don't even realize. For instance, we talked about last week, Diane is a common name in America, but Diane is the name of Artemis, the god of, she's the huntress in the Greek pantheon, and so that's it's a pagan name. Diane is a pagan name. So, but we don't think like that, and you're not necessarily beholden to a pagan culture simply because you have a name from a pagan culture, right? We just assimilate all kinds of words into our language from other cultures, and we just use them, and people... It's interesting to me that even the word Christmas, people have no clue what Christmas means, right? If you talk to a secular person, what is Christmas? You go to Japan, what is Christmas? Oh, it's a time that you order Kentucky Fried Chicken on the 25th of December. And so because KFC had a big, promotion back in the 80s, and all of Japanese people seem to think that Christmas is about Kentucky Fried Chicken. They have no idea what Christ is, and then the word literally means Christ Mass. Mass is the Latin word for communion. So it means the festival of communion celebrated on Christmas Day for the birth of Jesus, right? So people are so far away from what the original meaning is that a lot of Americans even just use the word Christmas as even though it's specifically Christian, people use the word Christmas as if it's not religious at all. And in some ways, though, that's better than nothing. I think it's worse when we start to change the word to winter vacation for schools instead of Christmas break. But the friends of Daniel ended up having to live with these names. And let's see. So Shadrach is the next name, and that's comes from the Babylonian phrase that means command of Aku. Okay, Aku was the moon god of the Babylonians. And then Meshach is a name that means who is what Aku is. It's again like that one we saw earlier in the Hebrew that meant who is like God is. So it's kind of like a play on the words. He's almost like changing it from who is what God is to who is what Aku is. So the Babylonians are trying to displace Yahweh from the culture of these Jewish people and saying, your God is nothing. I destroyed your country, so obviously your God is weak. Now I'm going to give you the name of a real God, a God who can destroy things and take over. And so now you need to pray to and be worship, Marduk or Bel or Aku. And then the last one is Nebo. And so Abednego comes from a Babylonian word that means servant of Nebo. And Nebo was the god of wisdom in the Babylonian pantheon. So, he just changed their names to something that had to do with Babylonian gods. And they could have, resisted completely against it. And, but there's some hills that you just don't want to die on, right? What your name gets changed to is not nearly as bad as what they were being asked to do, because in the Old Testament it doesn't say, thou shalt not take on any pagan names in your, for your children, right? There's no law about that. But there is a law about what you eat. And so that's what happens in the next section. So could someone read verse 8?
Royal food and wine. Israelites considered food from Nebuchadnezzar's table to be contaminated because the first portion of it was offered to idols.
Is that verse 8?
Oh, I think you're reading your Bible's commentary on it, which is good, because that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, that is verse 8, but
Yeah.
a little somewhat amplified. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way.
So Daniel is speaking for the other young men as they're in this new culture, and they have to obey. They're supposed to study all these things. There's nothing wrong with studying foreign cultures. The difference is studying it and believing it are two different things. I studied in Korea at a Korean university, and I studied under a Buddhist professor while I was in seminary, and I studied Buddhism. Well, I'm not a Buddhist, and I don't believe in Buddhism, but I studied it because I wanted to have, a first-rate education from a person who actually wasn't a professional in teaching a foreign religion. Because, I've studied lots of foreign religions. And so that's what they're doing. They're going to study this foreign religion. They're going to study, but they're not going to fall prey to what had happened in the exile. They had gone into exile because they had broken God's law, the Torah. And one of the laws in the Old Testament says, do not eat food offered to idols, do not eat any unkosher food, any unclean food. And so what made the food that was unclean, or what made the food unclean or unkosher that would defile them?
It was offered to idols.
That's right. So the royal food and the wine. So
It also wasn't prepared the way that they were told the food had to be prepared.
That's right.
It wasn't bled out first.
exactly. So in the book of Leviticus, it tells us that, in order for meat to be kosher, it has to be a certain type of animal. So certain animals were just off limits, right? You couldn't eat any shellfish, couldn't eat any crustaceans, couldn't no fish without scales. If they don't have scales, you can't eat them, right? So that includes shark. You can't eat shark, can't eat lobster. Yeah.
And eat pig.
Yeah. So can't eat pigs, because it says you shall not eat any animal that has a cloven hoof that does not chew its cud. And chewing the cud is you have to have two stomachs, and that's when the animal eats the grass and then semi-digests it, swallows it into their first stomach, and then it digests it more, and then they burp it up, and then that's chewing the cud, where they swallow it for the second time, it goes to their second stomach. And so, whether or not, that had any health benefits, some people try to explain the kosher laws as health benefits, like, God was just trying to keep them safe from, all kinds of, trichinosis, which is a disease you can get from uncooked pork. But God could have simply said, thou shalt not eat any pork that's not cooked thoroughly. Right? So as you barbecue it, make it well done, and it's okay then. But, he didn't say that. But the royal food then is this food that's either prepared incorrectly, because they didn't drain the blood correctly, or it was food that was part of the list of unkosher things that's found in Leviticus. And of course the wine, why would wine be bad? Couldn't the Jewish people drink wine? They did at the Passover. But everything that was offered at the king's table had first been offered to the gods. So there's a wine offering is called an oblation. You take a cup and you pour a portion of the wine onto the altar of the god, and you say a prayer, and that's called an oblation. It's a liquid sacrifice. And so that's where this wine came from. So they were not going to have anything to do with anything dedicated to a foreign deity and put it in their own bodies. So it wasn't that they couldn't eat meat or drink wine. They just didn't want to eat the wine and the food that was already dedicated to a foreign god. So it was bad enough they had the name of a foreign god now, but they're not going to eat the food to these foreign gods. So, and that had to do with the idea that their naming, being given a different name was not necessarily sinful, but there are laws about the foods that they were supposed to eat. And the Jewish people had ignored some of those laws over the centuries, and so they really came to the conclusion, now that we're in exile, we better shape up. We better cut those things out of our diet, right? No more pork, no more lobster. We're going to eat the way that God intended for us to eat, because we don't want to make him angry. Because, they knew that they deserved the exile, but now they were going to try, not that they were going to earn their way back into God's favor, because God had already told through Jeremiah that God would forgive their sins and that he would bring them back from the exile. And he even promised 70 years you'll be in exile and then you'll be returned. So they had hope that God was going to show them mercy. But, there's not going to be mercy for people who aren't thankful or repentant or obedient. So they were trying to do those things out of love for God, not out of trying to earn their salvation. Okay, verse 9.
And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs.
Okay, so the word order is important here, because it says that the official, did the official decide to listen to Daniel? Was it like he said, that makes sense. I'm gonna let you eat what you want to eat? Or is there who's doing the verbs in this sentence?
God.
That's right. So notice it says that God had caused the official to show favor. It doesn't say that the official showed him favor. God caused him. So because it's a passive sense, it shows us that the real actor in this, not only in this verse, but the whole book, is God. And that's an important thing, because there's an underlying theme in the book of Daniel that God is in control of history. And so he's going to make sure that the things that are happening to these young men are going to fulfill his will. So what do you think God's will is for Daniel and his three friends?
They would honor him.
Okay, they would honor him. What else, though?
To show that their God was greater than
There we go.
gods were being worshipped by the.
That's right. They are gonna be witnesses that Yahweh is stronger than Marduk or Bel, whatever they wanted to call him, because they were given these false names, and they're like, well, our God is still stronger than these other gods, and we're going to show it by the way that we're going to trust in our God, and then we're not going to get sick by eating a different diet. Okay, and then I think the third thing is that they're called by God to be a witness to the king and to the culture about these false gods and how Yahweh is the true God. So it's similar to what you said. But definitely, God is working throughout the text in order to show us that Daniel has a mission, right? Because Daniel's name, again, means my judge is God, right? So he knows that to escape the judgment of God is only to trust in God. So faith is what allows a person to not be judged by God. But the people of this pagan culture, their lives are going to be a witness to the truth, and if they ignore it, then Yahweh is going to judge them. And actually, we'll find that out later on when Nebuchadnezzar gets, he goes crazy as a result of God trying to humble him because of his sins. Okay, let's see. So it tells us that God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. Okay, so not only favor, but sympathy. Those two things are important. Showing the favor meant that he recognized that his request was not necessarily unreasonable, right? I mean, actually it's interesting because he hasn't even given him the reason, right? He was going to try to come up with a reason for the guard to actually allow them to have a different diet, but he didn't. All he said is he didn't want to do it, and then it says that God caused the official to show favor, and then the sympathy has to do with feeling with the people. So he probably thought, you guys were taken as children from your homeland, And now this is a completely different area. I mean, obviously your lives are turned upside down, so you probably felt for them and thought, these young men who want to eat, water and vegetables, what's the big deal, right? I'll let them do it. He felt bad for them, okay? But then verse 10, he does express his worry, and then Daniel doesn't disrespect him. This is an important thing. The way that we should act in a pagan culture is that we don't have to rail against it, but we can respect it, because God will use that gentleness and that respect to reach the foreign culture with the gospel. Okay, verse 10.
The official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you."
So, here the official is kind of being uncharacteristically open, right? I mean, do police officers share with people who are supposedly criminals how they're feeling about the whole situation? Probably not, right? Yeah, and politicians don't usually, open up to their constituents about their lifestyles and what they're doing. Yeah, so, this is very rare. Why in the world is Ashpenaz talking to Daniel like this? It's only because God had intervened. Yeah, so God's in control. So God can soften the hearts of our enemies. I know I was listening to a video today about a woman she was an atheist who became a Christian, and she was talking about how she used to listen to a guy on the internet called the Raving Atheist, and this guy he hated Christians so much that he was almost like spitting when he was like, he would talk about how horrible Christians are. And then she mentioned at the end of her talk, this woman who became a Christian herself, she went back to his website years later and found that he had become a believer in Jesus Christ. So it was amazing how God can change people's lives. And she had mentioned how when she started becoming a Christian, she was reading the comments of Christians who were patiently and respectfully making points against this atheist guy's rants. And they didn't call him an idiot. They simply said, "Have you considered this? Why don't, we're going to pray for you." And he was all mad at them, but it worked because it changed his life. So maybe Daniel's attitude towards this man is going to change his life. And we don't know, but in heaven we'll know. And when it says, "I'm afraid of the Lord my king," I think that literally in Hebrew it says, you would make my head guilty to the king, right? So that's a Hebrew phrase that means, that I would be at risk if I didn't feed you correctly, right? So, and then he explains what that risk is, because he says, the king would have my head. So he knows that, Nebuchadnezzar is a crazy king. I think that from a psychological description of his character, that Nebuchadnezzar was a megalomaniac, which means is a person who has believes that they are the only person who knows anything. They're the people who are completely right. So if you have that type of attitude, everybody's wrong, I'm the only one who knows anything, and I'm going to get mad at everybody who doesn't agree with me. That's a megalomaniac. So Nebuchadnezzar was like that. So this is, we know in history that that's probably a good description of Hitler, right? Hitler was like that. Maybe Stalin as well. But definitely there's been lots of people in history who've been like that. So those are dangerous people to be around, because anything can set them off. But in the ancient world, that was kind of a common thing for kings, because you know the story of Esther, right? Esther was she got married to the king, and then because she was Jewish, she could have been killed when the king passed a law to have all the Jewish people killed, and then her cousin Mordecai says to her, "You need to go talk to the king about not having the Jewish people killed." And she says, "I can't just walk in on him, because if I walk in without being invited, I could be executed." And he says, "Well, it's probably for times such as this that God made you the queen then." And so she decides that she'll risk her life. So it's the same kind of thing, is that, this guy knew that Nebuchadnezzar could kill him if he said anything that Nebuchadnezzar didn't like. And so he's voicing this concern, and Daniel doesn't just say, well, just, stand up to him. You can't do that to people like Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't even an option. Verse 11.
Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah,
Okay, we'll keep going.
test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink.
So we got Daniel is talking to the guard about, that verse 11 just simply says he's talking to the guard, and then he gives them an option, right? So, and this is not unreasonable. In fact, if anything, it's easier. You don't have to bring in any meat. You don't have to bring any wine. These guys are going to sit at their own little table, and he says, let us just eat vegetables and water to drink, right? And so for 10 days. But, if you live in a culture that believes that the food of the gods is the only thing that's going to sustain you, and you're not eating that, what do you think is going to happen?
Get sick.
Yeah, so the official probably believed that would have been a dangerous thing, but can you eat vegetables and water and drink water for a long time and survive? Sure, it's not going to kill you. There's lots of vegetarians who do this, and there's even,
Some vegetables.
yeah, it depends on what vegetables they are, right? Yeah, some vegetables are better than others.
Well, you better have some beef.
Yeah, Brussels sprouts might be good for you, but lettuce, I don't know how you can live off of lettuce and water. That's not going to help you at all.
Peas and beans and things like that.
Yeah, so legumes. Well, see, the thing is that what we call vegetables, technically, doesn't always include, legumes might be a different category scientifically, but I'm not too sure what they considered to be vegetables, but
Well, if you-
it was
if
anything that
you
wasn't
say
meat.
Vegetation, you just mean anything living,
Anything that's
growing.
not meat, right? Anything that's not meat.
Yeah, plants,
Yeah.
full of plants.
So yeah, that's a pretty wide selection of things that you can eat, and
Wow.
there's not really any plants in the Old Testament that are off limits. It doesn't say that potatoes are unkosher or something. I don't think they had potatoes. But it doesn't ever mention any vegetables.
South America.
Yeah, it doesn't mention any vegetables in the Bible that are
Yeah,
bad
they
for you.
mention lentils.
Yeah, so it doesn't mention some. Okay, so this you've probably heard of the Daniel diet. Has anybody heard of that?
No.
You haven't? So yeah, who's the pastor down at in South County? He wrote the
Rick Warren?
Rick Warren. Yeah, Rick Warren. After he wrote the book about the purpose-driven life, he also wrote a book called The Daniel Diet, and it was based on this passage. And so people in his church have gone on a diet where I think maybe 40 days, right? So you go for 40 days only drinking water and eating vegetables. You lose some weight when you do that.
The Strong's Dictionary, the Hebrew word for vegetables, that's translated vegetables,
hmm
it means something that's sown. So basically means anything that's been planted
Right.
to be eaten.
Yeah, and the majority of those would be things that are sown. Usually, you think about barley and wheat and stuff like that. So they're talking about eating bread and stuff like that. A lot of carbs, where some vegetarians might say, "Well, that's not good for you."
Eat barley and lentils and whatever grows along the between the rivers corridor
Mhm.
there, which is nothing but a mud flat. I think growing things is about the best thing to do in that area.
Right. Well, that's the good thing about Mesopotamia is that they had ample water, right?
They had
So
ample
they
water,
could.
They had ample dirt, and they had almost nothing else.
Yeah.
They had water and dirt.
Yeah, but they didn't. A lot of this would include fruits as well, right? So when it says vegetables here, that would have included things like
Anything
watermelons
that's grown
and all kinds of
for
melons.
food. Yeah, melons.
So in verse 13, he goes on to ask about what the test would include. Somebody read that?
Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see.
So the important thing, I think, is how Daniel doesn't just create a problem for the official. He brings a solution with the problem. So this is a good way of dealing with things in life. If you are the type of person who says, I think we should be doing this, or this is the problem at this church, or this is the problem in my business, or this is the problem in my family, what happens is you just become a negative person instead of a solution, a person who comes up with solutions. So Daniel doesn't create a problem. He finds the solution to the problem by saying, just observe, see how good we're going to look. And he's probably thinking, if you eat just vegetables, you're not going to be strong enough. Because part of their training would have not just been, education, but it would have kind of been like a boot camp. They would have had to exercise and to become stronger because, even the word for shalom, which means peace, it doesn't just mean a peace of mind. It means a wholeness. You could actually translate that as health. So the regiment that they would have gone through would have been something that included their intellectual strengthening as well as their bodies. So it really would have been, they would have been living there and being observed and seeing how strong they can get in order to become the best wise men to give advice to the king as possible. And by telling the official that compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. So these other guys are going to be, eating the regular diet, and we're going to just eat this vegetables and water, and just see for yourself. So it is possible that they could have lost weight, they could have gotten thin, they might have gotten sick, because if they're doing a bunch of exercises and you're not getting enough calories, it's not going to be good for you. So part of this is just depending on God to be faithful. So if they obey God's will to only eat food that's kosher, will they get sick by doing so? And God is not going to let that happen. I mean, it's possible it could have happened that way, but God is honoring their obedience, right? I don't think God ever dishonors our obedience, but we have to be careful that our obedience to God's word doesn't become a law unto itself. Why were Daniel and his friends trying to follow the kosher laws of the Old Testament?
Because God had told them to follow that.
Is that the only reason? Because God had told them, so they were just strictly obeying God.
They wanted to give him praise.
They wanted to give him praise. It was a way of showing him love and honor, right? So if we go through the motions to follow God's laws just because we think that we have to obey them, because if we don't, we get in trouble, then we're seeing God as a judge. See, what had happened is that the Old Testament people had seen God as a judge, but now, in the exile, they recognized that God isn't just our judge. He's judging us, but if he really would have judged us, he would have wiped us out, but he didn't. So he's obviously a gracious God. Why are we in exile? He's doing something while we're in the exile. He's forming us. He's disciplining us. And how are we going to react? Are we going to be like we were in the past, where the Jewish people started to say, "Oh, God, why worship God when you can worship Baal and do your own thing?" And these people in the exile said, "Why wouldn't we worship God? Because he could have destroyed us and he didn't." So it was out of love that they wanted to obey these laws. So that was a big flip on obeying the law because God told me to, and obeying the law because I want to honor my God because I love him. And that sometimes it's hard to see that difference. A lot of people in the church today might look at this and say, "See, they obeyed, and that's what got them through it. And so if you obey God, you'll be rich, you'll be successful." No, is that true? No, because Job was honoring God, and he had all kinds of bad things happen to him. So obeying God is not a guarantee that you're going to be successful or healthy or whatever. The reason why they did it was because they loved God, and that was the only reason that they did it. If bad things had happened to them and they went into jail, so be it. Because in that we see that that's the truth about what happens in the next story coming up after this about the fiery furnace, right? Because in the fiery furnace story, the young men are told, worship the idol or I'll throw you in the fiery furnace. And what do they say? They say no. And then they say, even if our God doesn't save us, we still won't do it. They don't know if God's going to save them. They thought, sure, maybe we're going to die, But if we only try to obey God to get out of the pain of suffering in a fiery furnace, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. So we know that they had the right reason, because they said, even if our God doesn't save us from the fiery furnace, we still won't obey, or we won't bow down to the idol. So that's the same thing here. Even if you make us eat this food that's offered to idols, we won't do it. We'll rather die than to stop worshiping our God. So their heart's in the right place. God knows that, and God's honoring their faith. Okay, we'll finish off this section in verse 14.
So we agreed to this and tested them for 10 days.
Okay, well, go ahead and read the next paragraph, since we want to complete the sentence, or the thought.
Read the next paragraph.
Next paragraph.
Yep.
At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead.
So notice that in verse 16 it says the guard took away their choice food. So they were still being given the food, but they weren't touching it. It was almost like the thing is like, okay, sure, you want to try to honor your God, but just in case you change your mind, here's the good. So they laid out that filet mignon. They laid out the pinot noir, and it was sitting there on the table next to the water and the vegetables. I mean, talk about a temptation. It wasn't as easy as simply saying, okay, we want to honor our God, so just give us some stuff that's kosher. They had to have the resolve and the obedience to try to do this in the face of looking at food that looked good, probably smelled good, probably, I'm sure, that tasted good. And it's not the food that you eat that makes you holy. It's the attitude in which you come to it, right? And so an important verse, we'll just conclude with this, is in Mark's gospel, where Jesus says it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you sinful, but it's what comes out of your heart. And then it says, I think this is Mark chapter 10, it says, thus Jesus declared all foods to be clean. And so we have to recognize that in the book of Daniel, these young men and Daniel are not avoiding the foods of the king because they thought they were better than other people, or that they were trying to earn God's love. They were doing it because they wanted to honor their God, who had already shown them so much mercy by bringing them through the exile, saving their lives, and now raising them up to a point of influence. I mean, being part of a government, a foreign government, that's where you can make changes. And if God hadn't brought them to this point, they believed that God wouldn't bring them to what God wouldn't bring them through. Why would God bring you to become a governor of the Babylonian Empire if God wasn't going to protect you while you were doing it? And that's what they believed he was going to do, and that's what God will do. But sometimes, our biggest influence is not always just by being able to pass laws, but maybe it's to be a martyr. So they were ready to be martyrs, but that's not what God intended for them. But it's good to see where their heart was. Okay, so that we'll start next time on verse 17. And then I'm going to be on vacation next week, so we'll start in 2 weeks.